Hello and welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer. Where we last left off in Danny the Champion of the World, Danny's father, William, tells Danny about the great shooting party that loathsome Mr. Victor Hazel has at the start of every shooting season. Well, after his incident with, in the pit, William has an idea to humiliate Mr. Victor Hazel, and he has just let Danny in on the secret. But now they must figure out a way of how to go through with the plan, so to speak. Are you ready? Alright, let's begin. Chapter 11. Sleeping Beauty. 5 minutes later, I was lying on my bunk in my pajamas. My father came in and lit the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling. It was getting dark earlier, no? Well, that's fall, for you. All right, he said. What sort of story shall we have tonight? Dad, I said, wait a minute. What is it? Can I ask you something? I've just had a bit of an idea. Go on, he said. You know that bottle of sleeping pills Doc Spencer gave you when you came back from the hospital? I never used them. Don't like the things. Yes, but is there any reason why those wouldn't work on a pheasant? My father shook his head sadly from side to side. Wait, I said. It's no use, Danny. No pheasant in the world is going to swallow those lousy red capsules. Surely you know that. You're forgetting the raisins, Dad. The raisins? What's that got to do with it? Now listen, I said. Please listen. We take a raisin, we soak it to its swells, then we make a tiny slit in one side of it with a razor blade. Then we hollow it out a little. Then we open up one of your red capsules and pour all the powder into the raisin. Then we get a needle and thread it very carefully, and very carefully we sew up the slit. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father's mouth slowly beginning to open. Now, I said, we have a nice, clean, cooked-looking raisin, chock full of sleeping pill powder, and that ought to be enough to put any peasant to sleep. Don't you think so? My father was staring at me with a look of such wonder in his eyes he might have been seeing a vision. Aha! Oh, my darling boy, he said softly. Oh, my sainted aunt! I do believe you've got it. Yes, I do. He was suddenly so choked up with excitement that for a few seconds he couldn't say any more. He came and sat on the edge of my bunk, and there he stayed, nodding his head very slowly up and down. You really think it would work? I asked him. Yes, he said quietly. It'll work all right. With this method we could prepare 200 raisins, and all we'd have to do is scatter them around the feeding grounds at sunset and then walk away. Half an hour later, after it was dark and the keepers had all gone home, we would go back into the woods, and the pheasants would be up in the trees by then roosting, and the pills would be beginning to work, and the pheasants would be starting to feel groggy. They'd be wobbling and trying to keep their balance, and soon every peasant that had eaten one single raisin would topple over unconscious and fall to the ground. Why, they'd be dropping out of the trees like apples. All we'd have to do is walk around picking them up. Can I do it with you, Dad? And they'd never catch us either, my father said, not hearing me. We simply strode through the woods, dropping a few raisins here and there as we went, and even if they were watching us, they wouldn't notice anything. Dad, I said, raising my voice, you will let me come with you? Danny, my love, he said, raising a hand on my knee and gazing at me with eyes large and bright as 2 stars. If this thing works, it will revolutionize poaching. Yes, Dad, but can I come with you? Come with me, he said, floating out of his dream at last. But, my dear boy, of course you can come with me. It's your idea. You must be there to see it happening. Now then, he said, bouncing up off the bed, where are those pills? The small bottle of red capsules was standing beside the sink. It had been there ever since my father returned from the hospital. He fetched it and unscrewed the cap and poured the capsules onto my blanket. Let's count them, he said. We counted them together. There were exactly 50. That's not enough, he said. We need 200 at least. Then he cried out, Wait! Hold it. There's no problem. He began carefully putting the capsules back into the bottle, and as he did so he said, "All we've got to do, Danny, is divide the powder from one capsule among 4 raisins. In other words, quarter the dose. That way we would have enough to fill 200 raisins." "But would a quarter of one of those pills be strong enough to put a peasant to sleep?" I asked. "Of course it would, my dear boy. Work it out for yourself. How much smaller is a peasant than a man?" "Many, many times smaller." "There you are, then. If one pill is enough to put a fully grown man to sleep, you'll only need a tiny bit of that for a peasant. What we're giving them will knock the old peasant for a loop. He won't know what's hit him." "But, Dad, 200 raisins aren't going to get you 200 pheasants." "Why not?" "Because the greediest birds are surely going to gobble up about 10 raisins each." "You've got a point there," my father said. "You certainly have. But somehow I don't think it will happen that way. Not if I'm very careful and spread them out over a wide area. Don't worry about it, Danny. I'm sure I can work it." "And you promised I can come with you?" "Absolutely," he said. "And we shall call this method the Sleeping Beauty. It will be a landmark in the history of poaching." I sat very still in my bunk, watching my father as he put each capsule back into the bottle. I could hardly believe what was happening, that we were really going to do it, that he and I alone were going to try to swipe practically the entire flock of Mr. Victor Hazel's prize peasants. Just thinking about it sent little shivers of electricity running all over my skin. "Exciting, isn't it?" my father said. "I don't dare think about it, Dad. It makes me shiver all over." "Me too," he said. "But we must keep very calm from now on. We must make our plans very, very carefully. Today is Wednesday. The shooting party is next Saturday." "Cripes," I said. "That's in 3 days' time. When do you and I go up to the wood and do this job?" "The night before," my father said. "On the Friday. In that way, they won't discover that all the peasants have disappeared until it's too late and the party has begun." "Friday's the day after tomorrow. My goodness, Dad, we'll have to hurry if we're going to get 200 raisins ready before then." My father stood up and began pacing the floor of the caravan. "Here's the plan of action," he said. "Listen carefully. Tomorrow is Thursday. When I walk you to school, I shall go into Stephen's store in the village and buy 2 packets of seedless raisins. And in the evening we shall put the raisins in to soak for the night." "But that only gives us Friday to get ready 200 raisins," I said. "Each one will have to be cut open and filled with powder and sewed up again. And I'll be at school all day." "No, you won't," my father said. "You will be suffering from a very nasty cold on Friday, and I shall be forced to keep you home from school." "Hooray!" I said. "We will not open the filling station at all on Friday," he went on. "Instead, we will shut ourselves in here and prepare the raisins. We'll easily get them done between us in 1 day. And that evening, off we shall go up the road towards the wood to do the job. Is that all clear?" He was like a general announcing the plan of battle to his staff. "All clear," I said. "And Danny, not a whisper of this to any of your friends at school." "Dad, you know I wouldn't." He kissed me goodnight and turned the oil lamp down low. But it was a long time before I went to sleep. Chapter 12. Thursday and School. The next day was Thursday, and before we set out for the walk to my school that morning, I went around behind the caravan and picked 2 apples from our tree, one for my father and one for me. It is a most marvelous thing to be able to go out and help yourself to find your own apples whenever you feel like it. You can do this only in the autumn, of course, when the fruit is ripe. But all the same, how many families are so lucky? Not 1 in 1,000, I would guess. Our apples were called Cox's Orange Pippins, and I liked the sound of the name almost as much as I liked the apples. At 8 o'clock, we started walking down the road towards my school in the pale autumn sunlight shine, munching our apples as we strode along. Clink went my father's iron foot each time he put it down on the hard road. Clink, clink, clink. "You brought the money to buy the raisins?" I asked. He put a hand in his trouser pocket and made the coins jingle. "Will Stephen's be open so early?" "Yes," he said. "They open at 8:30. I really loved those morning walks to school with my father. We talked practically the whole time. Mostly it was he who talked and I who listened, and just about everything he said was fascinating. He was a true countryman. The fields, the streams, the woods, and all the creatures who lived in these places were a part of his life. Although he was a mechanic by trade, and a very fine one, I believe he could have become a great naturalist if only he had a good schooling. Long ago he had taught me the names of all the trees and the wildflowers and the different grasses that grow on in the fields. All the birds, too, I could name, not only by sighting them, but by listening to their calls and their songs. In springtime we would hunt for birds' nests along the way, and when we found one he would lift me up onto his shoulders so I could peer into it and see the eggs. But I was never allowed to touch them. My father told me a nest with eggs, and it was one of the most beautiful things in the world. I thought so too. The nest of a song thrush, for instance, lined inside with dry mud as smooth as polished wood, and with 5 eggs of the purest blue, speckled with black dots. And the skylark, whose nest we once found right in the middle of a meadow, in a grassy clump on the ground. It was hardly a nest at all, just a little hollow place in the grass, and in it were 6 small eggs, deep brown and white. Why does the skylark make its nest on the ground where the cows can trample it? I asked. Nobody knows why, my father said, but they always do it. Nightingales nest on the ground too. So do pheasants and partridges and grouse. On one of our walks, a weasel flashed out on of the hedge in front of us, and the next few minutes I learned a lot of things about that marvelous little creature. The bit I liked best was when he said, "The weasel is the bravest of all the animals. The mother will fight to the death to defend her own children. She will never run away, not even from a fox, which is 100 times bigger than her. She will stay beside her nest and fight the fox until she is killed." Another time when I said, "Just listen to that grasshopper, Dad," he said, "No, that's not a grasshopper, my love, it's a cricket. And did you know that crickets have their ears in their legs? It's not true. It's absolutely true. And grasshoppers have theirs in their sides of their tummies." That's what they said in James and the Giant Peach. They are lucky to be able to hear at all, because nearly all the vast hordes of insects on this earth are deaf as well as dumb and live in a silent world. On this Saturday, on this particularly regular walk to school, there was an old frog croaking in the stream behind the hedge as we went by. "Can you hear him, Danny?" "Yes," I said. "That is a bullfrog calling to his wife. He does it by blowing out his dewlap and letting it go with a burp." "What is a dewlap?" I asked. "It's the loose skin on his throat. He can blow it up just like a little balloon." "What happens when his wife hears him?" "She goes hopping over to him. She is very happy to have been invited. But I'll tell you something very funny about the old bullfrog. He often becomes so pleased with the sound of his own voice that his wife has to nudge him several times before he'll stop his burping and turn around to hug her." That made me laugh. "Don't laugh too loud," he said, twinkling at me with his eyes. "We men are not so very different from the bullfrog." We parted at the school gates, and my father went off to buy the raisins. The other children were streaming in through the gates and heading up the path to the front door of the school. I joined them, but kept silent. I was the keeper of a deep secret, and a careless word from me would blow the lid off the greatest poaching expedition the world would ever see. Ours was just a small village school. Squat, ugly red brick building with no upstairs rooms at all. Above the front door was a big grey block of stone cemented into the brickwork, and on the stone it said, "This school was erected in 1901 to commemorate the coronation of His Royal Highness King Edward VII. I must have read that thing 1,000 times. Every time I went in the door it hit me in the eye. I suppose that's what it was there for. But it's pretty boring to read the same old words over and over again, and I often thought how nice it would be if they put something different up there every day. Something really interesting. My father would have done it for them beautifully. He could have written it with a bit of chalk on the smooth grey stone, and each morning you would have something new. He would have said things like, 'Did you know that the little yellow clover butterfly often carries his wife around in his back?' Another time he might have said, 'The guppy has funny habits. When he falls in love with another guppy, he bites her on the bottom.' Dear me! And another time, 'Did you know that the death's head moth can squeak?' And then again, 'Birds have almost no sense of smell, but they have good eyesight and they love red colors. The flowers that they like are red and yellow, but never blue.' Interesting. And perhaps another time he would get out his chalk and write, Some bees have tongues which they can unroll until they are nearly twice as long as the bee itself. This is to allow them to gather nectar from flowers that have very long, narrow openings. Or he might have written, I'll bet you didn't know that in some big English country houses, the butler still has to iron the morning newspaper before putting it on his master's breakfast table. Really? There are about 60 boys and girls in our school, and their ages went from 5 to 11. We had 4 classrooms and 4 teachers. Miss Birdseye taught the kindergarten, the 5-year-olds and the 6-year-olds, and she was a really nice person. She used to keep a bag of aniseed balls in the drawer of her desk, and anyone who did good work would be given an aniseed ball to suck right there and then during the lesson. The trick with aniseed balls is never to bite them. If you keep rolling them around your mouth, they will dissolve slowly out of their own accord. And then right in the very center you will find a tiny little brown seed. This is the aniseed itself, and when you crush it between your teeth, it has a fabulous taste. My father told me that dogs go crazy about it. When there aren't any foxes around, the huntsman will drag a bag of aniseed for miles and miles over the countryside, and the foxhounds will follow the scent because they love it so. This is known as a drag hunt. The 7- and 8-year-old girls were taught by Mr. Corrado, and he was also a decent person. He was a very old teacher, probably 60 or more. But that didn't seem to stop him from being in love with Miss Birdseye. We knew he was in love with her because he always gave her the best bits of meat at lunch when it was his turn to do the serving. And when she smiled at him, he would smile back at her in the sloppiest way you can imagine, showing all his front teeth, top and bottom, and most of the others as well. A teacher called Captain Lancaster took the 9- and 10-year-olds, and this year that included me. Captain Lancaster, sometimes known as Lankers, was a horrid man. He had a fiery carrot-colored hair and a little clipped carroty mustache and a fiery temper. Carroty-colored hairs also sprouted out of his nostrils and his ear holes. Ugh! He had been a captain in the army during the war against Hitler, World War II, and that was why he still called himself Captain Lancaster instead of just plain Mr. My father said it was an idiotic thing to do. There are millions of people still alive, he said, who had fought in that war, and most of them wanted to forget the whole beastly thing, especially those crummy military titles. Captain Lancaster was a violent man, and we were all terrified of him. He used to sit at his desk, stroking his carroty mustache and watching us with pale, watery blue eyes, searching for trouble. And as he sat there, he would make queer snuffling grunts through his nose, like some dog sniffing around a rabbit hole. Mr. Snotty, our headmaster, took the top form, the 11-year-olds, and everybody liked him. He was a small, round man with a huge scarlet nose. I felt sorry for him having a nose like that. It was so big and inflamed it looked as though it might explode at any moment and blow him up. A funny thing about Mr. Snotty was that he always brought a glass of water with him into class, and this he kept sipping right through the lesson. At least everyone thought it was a glass of water. Everyone, that is, except me and my best friend Sidney Morgan. We knew differently, and this is how we found out. My father looked after Mr. Snotty's car, and I always took his repair bills with me to school to save postage. One day, during intermission, I went to Mr. Snotty's study to give him a bill, and Sidney Morgan came along with me. He didn't come for any special reason. We just happened to be together at the time. And as we went in, we saw Mr. Snotty standing by his desk and refilling his famous glass of water from a bottle labeled Gordon's Gin. Oh! He jumped a mile when he saw us. You should have knocked, he said, sliding the bottle behind a pile of books. I'm sorry, sir, I said. I brought my father's bill. Ah, he said. Yes, very well. But what do you want, Sidney? Nothing, sir, Sidney Morgan said. Nothing at all. Off you go, then. Both of you, Mr. Snotty said, keeping his hand on the bottle behind the books. Run along. Outside in the corridor, we made a pact that we wouldn't let any of the other children know about what we had seen. Mr. Snotty had always been kind to us, and we wanted to repay him by keeping his dark secret all to ourselves. The only person I told was my father, and when he heard it, he said, "I don't blame him one bit. If I was unlucky enough to be married to Mrs. Snotty, I would drink something a bit stronger than gin." "What would you drink, Dad?" "Poison," he said. "She's a frightful woman." "Why is she frightful?" I asked. "She is a sort of witch," he said, "and to prove it, she has 7 toes on each foot." "Huh! And to think the 6-fingered man was sadistic enough." "How do you know that?" I asked. "Doc Spencer told me," my father answered. And then, to change the subject, he said, "Why don't you ever ask Sidney Morgan over here to play?" Ever since I started going to school, my father had tried to encourage me to bring my friends back to the filling station for tea and supper. And every year, about a week before my birthday, he would say, "Let's have a party this time, Danny. We can write out invitations and I'll go into the village and buy chocolate eclairs and donuts and a huge birthday cake with candles on it." But I always said no to these suggestions, and I never invited any other children to come to my home to school or at weekends. That wasn't because I didn't have good friends. I had lots of them. Some of them were super friends, especially Sidney Morgan. Perhaps if I had lived in the same street as some of them instead of way out in the country, things would have been different. But then again, perhaps they wouldn't. You see, the real reason I didn't want anyone to come back and play with me was because I liked being alone with my father better. By the way, something horrible happened on that Thursday morning after my father had left me at the school gate and had gone off to buy the raisins. We were having our first lesson of the day with Captain Lancaster, and he had set us a whole bunch of multiplication problems to work out in our exercise books. I was sitting next to Sidney Morgan in the back row, and we were both slogging away. Captain Lancaster sat up front at his desk, gazing suspiciously around the class with his watery blue eyes. And even from the back row I could hear him snorting and snuffling through his nose like a dog outside a rabbit hole. Sidney Morgan covered his mouth with his hand and whispered very softly to me. "What's 8 times 9? 72, I whispered back. Captain Lancaster's finger shot out like a bullet and pointed straight at my face. "You!" he shouted. "Stand up!" "Me, sir?" I said. "Yes, you blithering little idiot!" I stood up. "You were talking," he barked. "What are you saying?" He shouted to me as though I had a platoon of soldiers on the parade ground. "Come on, boy! Out with it!" I stood still and said nothing. "Are you refusing to answer me?" he shouted. "Please, sir," Sidney said. "It was my fault. I asked him a question." "Oh, you did you? Stand up!" Sidney stood up beside me. "What exactly did you ask him?" Captain Lancaster said, speaking more quietly now and far more dangerously. "I asked him what's 8 times 9, Sidney said. "But I suppose you answered him," Captain Lancaster said, pointing at me again. "He never called any of us by our names. It was always you, or boy, or girl, or something like that." "Did you answer him, or didn't you? Speak up, boy." "Yes, sir," I said. "So you were cheating," he said. "Both of you were cheating." We kept silent. "Cheating is a repulsive habit that practiced by gutter snipes and dandy-prats," he said. From where I was standing, I could see the whole class sitting absolutely rigid, watching Captain Lancaster. Nobody dared to move. "You may be permitted to cheat and lie and swindle in your own homes," he went on, "but I will not put up with it here." At this point, a sort of blind fury took hold of me, and I shouted back at him, "I am not a cheat." There was a fearful silence in the room. Captain Lancaster raised his chin and fixed me with his watery blue eyes. "You are not only a cheat, but you are insolent," he said quietly. "You are a very insolent boy. Come up here, both of you. Come up here." As I stepped out from my desk and began walking up towards the front of the class, I knew exactly what was going to happen. I had seen it happen to others many times, both to boys and girls. But up until now, it had never happened to me. Each time I had seen it, it made me feel quite sick inside. Captain Lancaster was standing up and crossing over to the tall bookcase and stood against the left-hand wall of the classroom. He reached up to the topmost shelf of the bookcase and brought down the dreaded cane. It was white, this cane, as white as bone, and very long and very thin, with one end bent over into a handle, like a walking stick. "You first," he said, pointing at me with the cane. "Hold out your left hand." It was almost impossible to believe that this man was about to injure me physically and in cold blood. As I lifted my left palm upward and held it there, I looked at the palm itself and the pink skin and the fortune teller's lines running over it, and I still could not bring myself to imagine that anything was going to happen to it. The long white cane went up high in the air and came down on my hand with a crack like a rifle going off. I heard the crack first, and about 2 seconds later I felt the pain. Never had I felt a pain such as that in my whole life. It was as though someone was pressing a red-hot poker against my palm and holding it there. I remember grabbing my injured left hand with my right hand and ramming it between my legs and squeezing my legs together against it. I squeezed and squeezed as hard as I could, as if I were trying to stop the hand from falling to pieces. I managed not to cry out aloud, but I couldn't keep the tears from pouring down my cheeks. From somewhere nearby I heard another fearful crack, and I knew that poor Sidney had just gotten it as well. But that fearful, searing, burning pain across my hand. Why didn't it go away? I glanced at Sidney. He was doing just the same as me, squeezing his hand between his legs and making the most awful face.